A perennial favorite among nonfiction readers, New York Times bestselling and award-winning author Erik Larson has penned 9 books, including Sioux City Public Library favorites The Devil in the White City, Dead Wake, The Splendid and the Vile, Thunderstruck, and one audio-only novella, No One Goes Alone.
Erik spent time as a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and a contributing writer for Time magazine. His magazine stories have appeared in publications like The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and Harper's. Welcome to the First 50 Pages, Erik.
Thank you.
So let's dive right into your new book, The Demon of Unrest. For listeners who may not be familiar yet with this title, can you tell us a little about what your latest book is about?
Yeah, nominally, it is about the 5 months between the election of Abraham Lincoln on November 6, 1860, and the start of the Civil War in April 1861. But to me, it's really much more than that. That was basically an excuse to explore Southern culture, to explore the telling details of life in this period, and above all, to capture the forces that coalesced in this period, that brought men and women on opposite sides of the Mason-Dixon line to the point where they could actually imagine the wholesale slaughter of each other.
Yeah, I think that was a great way to sum up your book.
For sure.
So as a personal fan of your work, it seems that you usually choose, lesser known subjects or maybe slightly obscure events that both inform and captivate readers. What was it about Lincoln and the months leading up to the advent of the Civil War that inspired you to change it up a bit, let's say, and write The Demon of Unrest?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not. Yeah, people often refer to this book as a Lincoln book. It's really not a Lincoln book, but he is definitely a key element of the story, obviously. But I am on record as having said repeatedly that I would never write a book about the Civil War, and here I am. My late mother said never, always said never say never, and there I am. It goes back to March of 2020, and I think you'll recall that was when the pandemic was at its peak. I was in the midst of a book tour for my previous book about Winston Churchill, The Splendid and the Vile. The tour got cut off halfway through because of the pandemic, and I flew home on my wife's birthday, and there I was suddenly with a lot of extra time on my hands. So I started, once again thinking about, what's my next project? What would I want to do for my next book? And I started looking into various subjects. Around that time, as now, unfortunately, around that time, there was a lot of talk from fringe groups and, frankly, fringe states about Civil War and secession. Texas was muttering about secession, and as it often does. And I started thinking to myself, I don't really know how the Civil War actually started. I mean, I knew roughly, but I didn't know the nitty gritty. Didn't know the real story. So I thought, I've got time on my hands. I'm just going to start, see what I can find. Ordinarily, when I get to this point in thinking about ideas, I would have jumped into a physical archive with no real sense of what I was doing, just to get a sense of a feel for the kind of archival resources that would be available. Obviously, with the pandemic in full flare, I could not do that. The archives were closed, and I sure as hell was not going to fly anywhere or take a train. But I'd started delving into some online archives, and because this field is so heavily studied, there are some really great archives out there. And one I came across, familiar, I'm sure, to every Civil War scholar, but brand new to me, was something called a collection of documents called The War of the Rebellion, the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. So I started wandering through this and found it compelling enough to order a bound volume of volume 1 of this multi-volume collection of records which spans the Civil War. So I get this volume. I'm in my pandemic readout out on Long Island. The book arrives. I disinfect it, and get down to reading. And I find it's just really compelling. This volume contains hundreds of documents, scrupulously curated in chronological order, with letters and responses, telegrams and responses, just all the sort of chronicling, as we journalists like to put it, the tick-tock of the march toward the Civil War, this
Yeah.
inexorable drive towards civil war. And suddenly I realized, that's going to be that's like a gift from God. This is like the spine of what could be a really compelling book. That I often think of the narrative spine of a book as a Christmas tree, and the fun part then comes in, which is hanging the ornaments on the tree. And so finding those ornaments, the little details that will light the imagination, became the thing that I embarked on at that point. But I was still not committed. I was still not wholly committed to this book. However, along comes January 6, 2021, and the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And make no mistake, it was an insurrection. And suddenly I realized, wait a minute, this story that I'm contemplating, this book that I'm contemplating, is not a story, stuck in the hoary old past. This is a story for today.
I really love that your own curiosity drove your research, through that. I think that's such, and you say it's, that is kind of your superpower, that you didn't, that you weren't a Civil War scholar. And I think that really comes through in the writing of this book, because it feels like we're discovering, these really cool things too, along those ornaments along the course of your writing.
Well, one of the things, speaking of ornaments, let me give you an example. Like, for example, Lincoln, before he sets out for Washington for his inauguration, he and his wife had a yard sale, and they sold various household goods. And in a collection called The Complete Works of Abraham Lincoln, there is a list of everything that was sold. It's a receipt showing all this stuff. And to me, that was very telling, because we all know about yard sales. We've all been to yard sales. Some of us have actually held yard sales. And here's Lincoln and his wife doing a yard sale to sell this stuff. And it just made them seem very human.
But we also just loved how you bring these moments of like brevity, or like little, snippets of, like you said, it makes them all the more human. These like mythic and historical figures where you poke fun that they like can't spell certain words, or, give a description of, I can't remember exactly who it was, but like his eyebrows were like cumulonimbus clouds, and just kind of give these like visuals that it makes it feel that much more real, and that you're more immersed in this era.
Hey, some of these guys look pretty funky, let me tell you. Horace Greeley, oh my. but my goal, one of the things I think that makes this book very different than other books that have touched on or dealt with this subject in this period, there's a lot of backstory leading up to Lincoln's election that is pretty necessary to know. Ultimately, it struck me that the way to capture this backstory, and I wrestled with this, and this was not an instinctive thing, I really thought about this, is through two characters in particular who do not typically appear in works on Civil War history, at least not as flesh and blood characters moving through the world. One was Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, who makes a fantastic villain, and is a terrific way of actually looking at Southern planter culture, at the evolution of something that's very important, and I think sometimes underestimated, is the pro-slavery movement, the pro-slavery ethos by which Southern planters persuaded themselves in the course of the 19th century, leading up to the Civil War, persuaded themselves that slavery was the best of all things, best of all worlds, that it was good for the planters, and it was especially good for the enslaved blacks who were owned by these planters, because all their needs were met. They weren't subject to the vagary of wage slavery in the North. Economic shifts had no effect, and so it's completely delusional thinking, But they nonetheless managed to persuade themselves that this was a good thing for everybody. Never mind that, in the case of Hammond, he had an instruction book for his overseer, in which one segment deals in very precise detail with how to whip his enslaved people. And then another character, Edmund Ruffin, was very important also, and he allowed me he allowed me to tell very important, two very important elements. One about the advent of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was like, throwing a hand grenade into the political landscape, and also the attack of John Brown on the Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and I could tell those through him in a very, very compelling way.
And it's true. When you're reading through this, I'm thinking, why don't these names sound familiar? Why don't I know these characters? Readers encounter a note from you at the beginning of the book titled Dark Magic that addresses the events in the Demon of Unrest and part of their connection to those events of January 6th. And one of the things that struck me is that you say, I invite readers to step into the past. And that's really what we get to do. That's really what this book gives us, to kind of experience that in a different way that you don't get to always with.
Well, my philosophy of this is, I'm often described as a historian, and I don't think of myself as a historian. Maybe a journalist who writes history is an apt thing, but my goal is to create a nonfiction historical experience that is as rich and deep as possible, with the idea that readers will begin reading the book and will sink into the past to the extent where and this is the beauty of the mind, this is the beauty of reading, where they will suspend their knowledge of what's coming.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like when one of my favorite books along those lines is Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. Which chronicles the start of World War One, the first month of World War One. I've read that at least 3 times. By the way, it has the most gorgeous opening paragraph, I think, in the history of literature. I've read that book 3 times. And each time I read that book, I find myself hoping that these people will not be so stupid as to start World War One. But of course, the war always starts, And but I do believe that readers can be placed into a position where they get caught up in the story, caught up in the suspense, not necessarily hoping this thing won't happen. They know it's going to happen. But in this case, knowing it's going to happen sort of adds to the pathos, adds in a way to the suspense, because you see these forces coalescing, and you know it's like a horror movie. When the protagonist in a horror movie hears this growling from the basement, and that's not her dog, right?
Yeah.
And she goes down in the basement anyway.
One of the details, I just have to share this, that I found hilarious. It made me laugh out loud, was that Fort Sumter was built on northern rocks. Like when I'm reading along and about the grievances of the South, and you do such a great job of kind of bringing us into that culture of the South, so that it gives us context and perspective of, all these things that are happening, with the people of the time, even.
Well, I'll tell you what fascinated me the most about Southern culture, and I really want to qualify that a bit and talk about South Carolina culture in particular, and Charleston, the planter aristocracy. But I was really intrigued by this cult of honor, if you will. They refer to themselves as the chivalry.
Yeah.
They refer to themselves as the chivalry. When I first came across that, I said, oh, no, they can't possibly be doing that. But yes, in diaries and so forth, they were the chivalry. And they were absolutely enthralled with, with the romance literature of the past. Sir Walter Scott was one of the most popular authors for the planting aristocracy to read. I mean, I would venture to guess that Ivanhoe was probably on everybody's shelf. And one of the things that intrigued me, especially, and when I first heard about these, I also thought that can't possibly be. And but I found an entire book devoted to the subject. But were these so-called rings tournaments, where planters would dress up in knightly garb and ride their stallions down this course with a lance, not jousting because they could kill somebody, but the goal being to pierce a hanging gold, hanging ring, and this was a mark of your prowess as a horseman, and also as your aim with a lance. If it was a heads and rings tournament, by the time you got to the end of the course, you were then to whip out your saber and slash away at an inanimate figure at the end of the course. So these were called rings tournaments, and they were commonplace, and very much a reflection of the chivalry being enthralled by notions of chivalry from the past.
Yeah, and I loved how you started each part of the book with a quote or a segment from the Quod Duello, if I'm saying that right, yes, and how that was kind of like the rules and regulations for honor and dueling, and just really how much that played a role in, Southern culture and Southern chivalry.
That said it all. To me about this real emphasis on honor, a sort of false honor actually, but real emphasis on honor. Here was this Code Duello that was written by a former governor of the state to codify how one went about conducting a duel. Now, the first portion of this Code Duello is basically devoted to trying to find ways to solve the situation other than necessarily shooting each other to death. But as the rules proceed, it becomes there are rules governing. If you can't resolve this, here's how you go about conducting a duel. Essentially, it's a guide to murder. When you think about it. And what intrigued me was that in microcosm, the Code Duello kind of described the pressures and forces that were at work in the broader macro political world. The South imbued with honor, the North deciding not deciding, but increasingly vehement about the fact that slavery was an abomination. The abolitionists in particular, and the Southerners, the owners of enslaved blacks who had come to decide that slavery was a very good thing, and therefore an honorable thing, and we are men of honor. And here's the North telling them that slavery was evil, which meant that these planters were evil. They took offense. So in a microcosm, that would have led to a duel, right? So and that's why I excerpt the Code Duello at the start of each of the so-called, I call them parts, each of the parts of this book stepping up toward the Civil War.
As librarians, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, we naturally have to touch on how you worked Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin into the book and of the impact of its publication. What really drove you to include it in the book?
Well, see, Uncle Tom's Cabin is if you were to look at a timeline of the nodes, the events that really helped fuel the dissonance. Can you fuel a dissonance? I'll go with it. To help fuel the dissonance between North and South. When this book came out with its basically recounting of the atrocities of slavery, the sale of separation and sale of families and so forth, it was a bombshell. The North utterly embraced this novel and Harriet Beecher Stowe. The South reviled this woman. She was referred to as this wretch in petticoats. And in fact, the Southern writers went so far as to write a series of counter novels. I have some of the titles in the book. I found some of these absolutely hysterical, right? But it was a very important moment in terms of the Gestalt in this period. This was Uncle Tom's Cabin was, if I recall this correctly, came out in 1851. As you advance, there are all sorts of other things that were beginning to take place, and I tell these, through my various characters. 1858, for example. 1858 was a pivotal year. This is the year that Senator James Henry Hammond gives a very important speech to the U.S. Before the U.S. Senate, a pro-slavery speech where he refers to enslaved blacks as the mudsills of society. Mudsills being in construction, the layer between the earth and the frame of the building. These were the mudsills of society. It was someone had to do the menial labor, and here at hand was the ideal race to do it, enslaved blacks. And he further coined this term that cotton, as he put it, cotton is king. Cotton is king. And his thesis was that you can make war on us, you dare not, because we supply the world's cotton. If that supply is cut off, Britain's mills go dead, the North goes into economic chaos. You cannot basically mess with the South because cotton is king. Very important moment. Same year, we have Lincoln, then not yet president, of course, with his issuing his House divided speech, very important speech, in which he says that the nation cannot exist as with both slavery and non-slavery, that one or the other has to prevail, and a house divided cannot stand, and so forth. Soon after that, there was another very important speech, again in 1858. These are three pivotal speeches, at least in my view. William Henry Seward eventually becomes Lincoln's Secretary of State, but who himself actually desperately wanted to be president. He delivers a speech that sort of touches on riffs on Lincoln's House divided speech, but he calls the conflict between slavery and the free states and so forth. He calls that quote unquote an irrepressible conflict. This is the great irrepressible conflict speech in which Seward, unlike Lincoln, this is a bellicose, overt attack on slavery and slaveholders that's issued on October 25th of that year. And this really shocked Southerners, and actually kind of shocked a lot of Northerners. It's probably the speech that caused Seward not to be nominated for president in May of 1860. But what happens then is a year later, we have John Brown attacking and seizing the federal arsenal in Virginia, now West Virginia. And many Southerners attributed that act directly to the irrepressible conflict speech. So all these elements are starting to fall into place with these events, and those are the events that I chose to tell through the eyes and experience of Senator Hammond, through the eyes and experience of another great villain named Edmund Ruffin, who hated the North, hated Yankees, wanted nothing better than to have a war, this kind of guy.
On your website, you share what I'd call a quote-unquote traditional author biography with your readers, but you also have an alternative biography section and give readers a visual glimpse into where you write through photos of your author's lair. I'm envious of your monkey lamps. They're fantastic. So you happen to note in that biography that you have a passion for dark, gloomy Scandinavian detective stories. Yes. Do you remember the book that sparked your passion for this genre? And is there a favorite that you recommend to your friends, or in this case, nosy librarians?
Oh, boy. I've been reading dark Scandinavian thrillers since I think I don't know when I came across the first, but probably when I was in college. There was a series. You will know this, and I could never pronounce the names, even though I have a Swedish and Scandinavian background, and I always get the names confused. But it's a pair of Swedish writers who wrote a really wonderful series of Swedish detective stories about the Swedish National Police, and their lead detective was Martin Beck, and the authors were Maj Soul and something. But they were I loved those books, and the first one I read, I am sorry to say I cannot remember the name, but it was a woman's name. It was about the death of a young woman and the investigation that followed. So, and that led me to explore others. And most recently, I've become a devotee of first of Henning Mankell, a Swedish writer, whose books are terrific. And his books, his lead character is Wallander, and of course that became a TV series with Kenneth, great TV series with Kenneth Branagh, who can do no wrong in my view. And then followed by a much darker series of Scandinavian detective stories by Joe Nesbo and his lead character Harry Hula. And I love those, although I don't know, they may be getting too dark even for me.
Of course, as librarians, we get asked for book recommendations all the time. And I really feel like your books are a great recommendation for someone who says they're interested in history. And I have to tell you, I get a bit of a thrill when I mention The Devil in the White City to someone who hasn't read it before. It's like, this, you read this one, this is the one. Okay. And I saw a post online where readers were naming books that they wish they could read again for the first time. And, as a fan, I just want to say I think that book, for me, The Devil in the White City, is one that I wish I could read again for the first time because it...
Oh, that's nice.
It opened my eyes to the sort of narrative nonfiction, these lesser known characters and history, and you'll just think, how do I not know these things? It was just fantastic.
Well, yeah. But thank you. But by the same token, though, I have to say that, I would like to say that I would like to actually have the experience of going over and researching that book without the angst that infused my life at that time. Because on the eve of publication of Devil in the White City, and this is I am not kidding, and my wife will back this up, I was convinced that my career was over. Because the book had two narratives that never really, well, they do touch in one tiny stretch, but two narratives that never quite touch. I was convinced that the reviewers of America would just take me and throw me through the window. Defenestration of author Erik Larson. It didn't happen, and I'm just so glad. But I love it when people tell me, in particular, that they were just in Chicago, and while they were there, they were reading my book. I love that because my favorite, actually, all-time reaction to any of my books came when I was touring through Chicago. I was at the Chicago Club. I had just done a talk. This woman got up during the question and answer period, and I swear she was near tears when she said this. She said, when I finished reading this book, I didn't want to come back.
Well, we can't thank you enough for the conversation today. And The Demon of Unrest is out now, available in bookstores and libraries everywhere. And whether you want to dip your toe into the waters of history or you are ready to dive deep, we think that your books will hit the spot for readers.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And can I do one radical thing at the end here?
Go for it.
Can I make a shout out to another author who I do not know, but whose books I have just fallen in love with, the Thursday Murder Club series.
Oh, yeah. Richard Osman. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. So anyway, that's my shout.
Yeah, they cannot stay on the shelf.
Yeah, people love them. They do. So fantastic.
Not even Scandinavian. I don't know what's wrong with them.
Well, I think now we have a new snippet that when people are like, have you heard about the series? I'll be like, well, Erik Larson loves it. So really, you should probably read it. Don't take our word for it.
Yeah.
Good.
And we highly recommend The Demon of Unrest and really all of your books. We know readers will not be disappointed in anything that they pick up by you. So it has been a pleasure to chat with you today.
Too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.